feel higher up and further away than is comfortable. So am I going to muck up the whole system, or I just
No, that's fine.
a little bit closer? That's a little bit better. Sisters and brothers, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today. I've got on a badge. I want to say something about chaplaincy, something about how I see chaplaincy at the heart of the Church of England's vision and strategy in these coming years. But I wanted to make a few preliminary remarks more generally to begin with, if you can bear it. And some of this has already been said, but I think it's really worth emphasising. Chaplaincy is very beautiful. It's a very beautiful ministry that you're part of, and in so many ways connected to but different from the ministry that most of the rest of us share. First of all, because in almost every place, it is lay and ordained working together in chaplaincy teams, which for me is an inspiration. At the heart of our hopes for our church, is that we might be a church where every baptised person understands the part that they have to play in God's great mission of love to the world. And I see that often lived out in chaplaincy more than anywhere else, because I visit hospitals and prisons and other places, and it's commonplace for that to be a team of lay and ordained people. Secondly, it's often an ecumenical team as well, which again, for me, points towards the church that God longs us to be. Oh dear, you're recording this, so I better be careful what I say. So I'll put it as mildly as I can. I don't get out of bed in the morning for the Church of England. I love the Church of England. I'm deeply committed to the Church of England, but that's not my motivation. My motivation is the gospel and the kingdom of God. To make Jesus known and to build God's kingdom of justice and peace in our world. And oh, how our world cries out for the good things that we see and have received in Jesus. And the church that God longs us to be must transcend our current differences, disagreements, and painful divisions. And again, often it's in chaplaincy that I see this lived out. Furthermore, often the very best interfaith relationships, and indeed, particularly when we look at the needs of our world, we need to work with all people of goodwill, but especially with people of other faiths, making common calls on issues of peace, human well-being and justice. Again, it's in chaplaincy that I most often see that lived out. And also, not yet said this morning, but let me say it, often I found it's in chaplaincy that there is a generous inclusivity, which I don't always see everywhere else in the church. And I know many, many clergy in particular, but not just clergy, have found a home and a welcome in chaplaincy that they haven't always found in other bits of ministry. I grieve for that, but I notice it and I give thanks for it. Also, but maybe not so positive, it depends how you look at it, chaplaincy often it's part-time. So I know that, I guess that some of you here are in full-time, part-time, it's all ridiculous, isn't it? I'm a bit of a part-timer. I've got into this really, really bad habit in recent years. I go to bed each night. I go to bed, I sleep for, hopefully 7, maybe 8, if I'm really lucky, 9 hours, and I'm unavailable. It would take a really, really, really serious emergency to get me out of bed at 3 in the morning. So I'm a part-timer. I do not devote every hour so it's ridiculous. But you know what I mean. Some of you are paid the equivalent of a full-time post to do this. Some of you are doing this alongside other paid ministerial posts. Some of you don't get paid at all in chaplaincy ministry. But again, I think that's a healthy thing, a healthy mixed ecology of different ways of working, of different bits of ministry informing and flowing from and into. They're my preliminary remarks. but I wanted to say it because that's also a long-winded way of saying thank you. Thank you for this network, for the work that you're doing. The papers you sent me were so helpful, interesting, insightful, informative. Thank you for this network, but through you, thank you to the chaplains who are often working both at the edge but also at the centre. You're working in the places of greatest need and greatest opportunity, but often find yourselves marginalised by the so-called mainstream church. I really regret that, and I think if the Church of England's vision and strategy for the 2020s has achieved anything, it has brought chaplaincy back into the centre of the picture, and I'm really pleased about that. I'm really pleased about that, and I think I know you are as well. You have been, in terms of strategic thinking about mission and ministry, I think you've often been the poor relation. That has changed. So, into the things I wanted to say to you. I mean, as has already been alluded to, the Church of England's vision and strategy for the Church of England, I'm always slightly embarrassed to tell people what it is, because it's so bloody obvious, isn't it? And you're like, is that the best you can do? Can't you come up with anything more original than that? We think God is calling us to be a Christ-centred and Jesus Christ-shaped church. I mean, surely that is the most obvious thing that anyone can ever say about the church, that we are the people of God who are centred on Jesus Christ. And yet at the same time as being the most obvious thing to say about the church, it is also the most profound. We will spend our lives plumbing the depths of what it is to be known and loved by God in Jesus Christ, and to share in God's mission of love to the world through Jesus Christ. I'm quoting from memory now, so I know I'm slightly misquoting, but Rowan Williams was once asked at something like this, a kind of Q&A, what's the church? And he replied something like, the church is that bunch of women and men who have been so impacted by the life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ that they've formed a small community around him and they're trying to change the world. Now I think that's a pretty good definition of the church. That's what I mean when I say God is calling us to be a Christ-centred church, to be deeply focused on Christ, to follow in his way, to go where he leads, and to work for the building of God's kingdom in the world. And from that central statement, which is therefore calling for a profound spiritual and theological renewal about what does it mean to be the church, especially for us in the Church of England, where we still bear the weight of establishment, Christendom, all the great privileges of being the Church of England, which, of course, we know can sometimes be experienced as great burdens. But flowing from that central, to be a Christ-centred church vision, we have identified three priorities. They are to be a church of missionary disciples, where every single person understands they have a part to play, that the great baptismal vocation. To be a church which is younger and more diverse, and I think it's really important that we recognise the demographics of the Church of England and seek intentionally to be younger and more diverse. But thirdly, the one that most impacts onto chaplaincy, and the one that has indeed turned out to be the most controversial, it's a bit of an ugly phrase, mixed ecology is the norm, is the phrase. A church where mixed ecology is the norm. I think you probably know what that means, but let me just briefly unpack it. It means paying attention to the whole ecosystem of the church. The church has always been an ecosystem, but we've not always paid attention to all of it. That's why, whenever I speak about mixed ecology being the norm, usually the first thing I speak about is chaplaincy. You know, I say the things I said to you a moment ago. The chaplaincy has always been a vital part of of the Church of England's mission and ministry, but we don't pay much attention to it. We certainly don't resource it with the same intentionality as we resource other bits of ministry. And yet, if you want, just to state the very, very obvious, if you want to be a church that is younger and more diverse, if you were starting from scratch, I think you might say to yourself, well, we need, therefore, to be present in those places where children and young people are. Now, this is not a sophisticated analysis nor a difficult thing to work out. Where are children and young people? Well, they are in parent and toddler groups, in schools, in colleges of further education, in universities. They are in the armed forces. And if you are an army chaplain or a school chaplain or a university chaplain, you will meet and encounter and have the opportunity to minister to more young people probably in a week, possibly even in a day, than many vicars will have in a whole year. So it's simply bonkers to not make the connection that if we believe we need to become a younger and a more diverse church, then we need intentionally to resource ministry in the places where young people are. I know that chaplains is a lot more than that, and I will come on to that. But first of all, just to dig a little deeper into the whole mixed ecology ecosystem metaphor, the other, which I find such a helpful metaphor for thinking about the church, not so different from what we find in the scriptures, where Paul describes the church as a body, where the elbow cannot say to the pancreas, I don't need you. So we know from our observation of the natural world that things thrive because of diversity. It's because of diversity that things thrive. And in the natural world, as we see the deepening climate crisis that we have created, it is the lack of biodiversity which is accelerating the debilitating and destructive change. We don't want that to happen in the ecosystem of the church. In the ecosystem of the church, particularly in a culture like ours, which is such a smorgasbord of cultures, we need to find ways of giving expression to the love of God in Jesus Christ in all the different contexts, the neighbourhoods and the networks that make up British society. And there is nothing new about this. The history of Christian mission could also be described as the history of cultural adaptability. Where do we read about this? Well, we read about it in the New Testament itself. We read about how, as the gospel of Jesus Christ through the church encountered new cultures, so the unchanging message of the Christian faith took on, as it were, the different clothes of different cultures. And some of the great, momentous theological disputes of the first 30 or 40 years of the church's life actually give us a pattern for how we missionally encounter new contexts. And I know that some people in the church resist this, imagining, I have to say falsely, that the way we have the church somehow arrived fully formed, and our job is simply to keep it going. But that's not what we read about in the New Testament. It's not what we observe in church history, and it will not meet the missional needs of a very, very diverse culture such as ours. And so what I usually say, I'm not sure there are any disbelievers of this in the room here, I doubt it, but maybe there is. I usually say to clergy who question this, I say, well look, when you cancel your 8 o'clock service, I'll sit down and have a chat with you about this. Because if, and of course still most churches do have an 8 o'clock service, if you have an 8 o'clock service and a 10 o'clock service, you have already crossed the missional Rubicon. You may not have realised you have, but you have. Because you've already said, within the one church, we will have two congregations. And those two congregations will have very different expressions of their worshipping life, but they remain the one church. If you really think it's wrong for the Church of England to put resources into messy church, hospital chaplaincy, if you really think we shouldn't be doing that, cancel your 8 o'clock, and then we can have a talk about it. But we need, I believe, a greater diversity of expressions of mission and ministry, and that's a big, big challenge to the Church of England institutionally, especially coming out of COVID at a time of real financial challenge for virtually every diocese. I know that as a diocesan bishop. But I also want to point out that every church was planted once. Somewhere in this church there'll probably be a notice board with the names of the vicars on it, and you're going to find vicar number 1, which will tell us when this church was planted. And therefore we need in our day to do what our predecessors did in their day, from Pentecost up till yesterday. We need to be developing new expressions of Christian church, new expressions of Christian ministry, chaplaincy alongside church planting, alongside parish ministry, and we need to encourage and develop the interflow and communication between those different bits of the ecosystem, not least because, the other obvious point I should have made at the beginning, many chaplains, ordained chaplains, are parish clergy. I think every lay volunteer chaplain is part of a worshipping community. So there is already, hardly any fresh expressions, church plants, things like that, hardly any of them happen, but that they flow from a vibrant, flourishing, mission-focused parish. So there really is no dispute here. However, it is the case that the Church of England for quite some time has tended to put most of its eggs in the one basket, which is the basket of parochial ministry. And of course it's not that we want to stop supporting parish ministry. As I said, most of the other ministries flow from it. But in the kind of culture we live in now, we do indeed need to think much more intentionally, what can chaplaincy offer? What doors can it open? What good can it do for the gospel of the kingdom that parish ministry is unlikely to achieve? And this, I think, is about becoming a church of the networks as well as a church of the neighbourhoods. Parish ministry, at its best, is primarily neighbourhood ministry. Chaplaincy is nearly always network ministry. Of course, I'm going to keep emphasising, of course the two belong together, they're not separate compartments. But, as I've already said, if you want to be a younger and more diverse church, then you should be putting resource into universities, school chaplains, and things like that. The only chaplaincy job I've ever had is I was a school chaplain for a bit. So I was canon pastor and vice dean of Peterborough Cathedral. And my main job was kind of pastoral care, congregational development, city centre mission. That was kind of the brief really, because Peterborough Cathedral operates a bit like the city centre parish church. So that was kind of the job. And almost in the small print of the job, that I'd hardly really noticed when I took the job, was that slightly unusually, the choir school for Peterborough Cathedral is the local Church of England Comprehensive School, which is a really imaginative way of doing choir school. And the canon pastor vice dean's job was to be the link with the school, and indeed to have the title school chaplain. And it said I should spend half a day a week in the school. So not a huge commitment of time. loved it. I absolutely loved it, and it was without doubt the most fruitful bit of my ministry at Peterborough. Very, very quickly, I didn't use the word planted, because underneath this cheerful exterior is an unreconstructed Anglo-Catholic, so just be aware of that. So I planted a Eucharist once a month in the school. Because it was a Church of England comprehensive school, there were a lot of kids there who had some kind of relationship with the church, and I just thought, I want to say Mass in the school. I didn't know whether anybody would come, but I got to know the kids. I was going in each week. We regularly got a congregation of about 50 kids coming once a month before school, and the Eucharist had to make it work. The Eucharist had to last 20 minutes, and I always preached, and the sermon was always 2 minutes, and I would get them to time them, which became a bit of a thing. And I said, okay, now it's time for the sermon. As you know, we've got to finish by X, because you've got to go to your lessons. So this sermon can't be more than 2 minutes. You know, get your phones out, you know, get your stopwatches out. Here goes. And it became a bit of a thing. It was wonderful, 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 fruitful ministry. And 20 years later, I still sometimes get letters from some of the kids who were in that school, part of that little worshipping community in the school, some of whom had lost connection with the church they had been part of. You know this. You know this. But knowing those opportunities, you know, why wouldn't we, as parish churches, as dioceses, why wouldn't we say we really need to try to make sure that there are chaplains in schools? I think I'm overrunning my time. I'll bring this into land. The ministry of the Church of England is pastoral and evangelistic. And I do need to let you know that I know that a lot of chaplaincy ministry will be very clearly pastoral and not overtly evangelistic. I do know that. But also I know that really, really good pastoral care is often the best evangelism. And that when you actually give yourself to a person unconditionally to care for them in a prison, in a hospital. I mean, when I was Bishop of Chelmsford, we set up a couple of shopping centre chaplaincies, which were really, really effective. And I was amazed how many people, you know, used, as it were, the shopping centre chaplaincy. So wherever it is, when you really give yourself to someone, it is powerfully evangelistic, even though that's not overtly the motive. So I think I want to finish with a challenge. And I do fully realise this changes from context to context, and really it's almost ridiculous to talk about chaplaincy as if it's one thing, when it's 100 different things. But nevertheless, if we are chaplains in the name of Jesus Christ, and even if we know that rightly, because of the constraints of the organisation in which we are operating as a chaplain, it would rightly be inappropriate to be overtly evangelising. Nevertheless, I want to challenge you and remind you that the greatest gift that we can give to another human being is the knowledge of the love of God in Jesus Christ. And that we want them to know Jesus. And we know that in knowing Jesus, they will receive the healing, the joy, the affirmation that they need. That the gospel is very, very beautiful. It is what the human heart craves. And therefore, even if we know that we cannot do this overtly, I encourage you to have the heart and the spirit of the evangelist in your ministry as a chaplain. Some of you, I mean, An obvious example is prison chaplaincy. I was in Humber Prison just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, the Humber prison chaplain is a star. Just very briefly, his backstory. He was sentenced for armed robbery, okay? Armed robbery. He went into a post office with a shotgun. He was sentenced for armed robbery about 20 years ago. He went to Humber Prison. On the night that he was imprisoned, he got down on his knees in utter desperation and prayed to the God that didn't believe him. And at such a low end, just said, God, if you can help me get through this somehow, I will follow you, and I will give myself to helping other people in prisons. What happened next is a long story. He didn't have a flashing lights Damascus Road experience. He had a quite long Emmaus Road experience, but in prison, through the chaplaincy, he did become a Christian. He did his time, and after 16 years, he was released. He got involved with his local church, and he got involved in chaplaincy ministry as a lay volunteer. He was ordained 5 years ago, and last year he applied for and got the job as lead chaplain for the Church of England at Humber Prison, the prison where he had been incarcerated for 16 years. You won't be surprised to hear that he's having a very effective ministry. He is an inspiration to meet and to talk with, and people are coming to faith in Jesus Christ in Humber Prison. It is amazing. Now, in that context, it is easier and possible to be more overt about bringing people to faith in Jesus Christ and establishing Christian communities. You won't be able to do that in a hospital in the same way. You just need to know I do know this. But I think if you are able to demonstrate more and more that it is chaplaincy that is best able to grow new Christian communities, to present the goodness and the beauty of Jesus Christ, and to see people coming to faith in different ways, then I want to end by saying it could be that in many ways the future of the Church of England belongs to chaplaincy, or might I say belongs to much more specialised ministry, working much more intentionally alongside and flowing from our parishes. I'm sorry I've overrun, I beg your pardon. At least I think of it.
You haven't.
Haven't I?
No, you're...
Oh right, well, in which case I'll finish with the story. Have I really
You've got 2 minutes.
Oh right, in which case I'll finish with the story. After I was canon pastor at Peterborough, I became the Bishop of Reading. And this is in Berkshire, the Royal County of Berkshire, no less. A seriously posh place. The most up, my kids said this is the most up itself place in the country. I lived in a very swanky, posh village on the River Thames. In the house that we lived in, it was, it had, of course, it had electronic iron gates. It was an executive house. So we lived in this. Our next door neighbours were a young couple in their sort of late 20s, maybe early 30s. Both had high-powered, very well-paid jobs in London. They commuted into London every morning. They left very early in the morning. If they came home at night at all, they came home very late. They were just as busy at the weekends with their leisure as they were during the week with their work. We never saw them. Never saw them. Weeks would go by and we didn't see them. And when we did see them, they were really good people. And they were fascinated about having a bishop living next door, and we kind of, we would talk about, sometimes things of faith, things of import, on the occasional, once every couple of months, where we bump into each other. And I often used to reflect, how will the Church of England ever reach out and connect with my next door neighbours? It certainly wasn't going to be through the church in the village, which was part of a small cluster of a multi-parish rural benefice, where there was one, expensive resource, a vicar, living in a vicarage. But the thing about these kind of communities is, my neighbours weren't unusual. This was one of those, most people didn't live in the village. They slept there occasionally. Their life was somewhere else. Their life was in their work. Their life was in their leisure. And I thought to myself, if they have children, if they do have a baby, we will have the parish church, the Church of England, as we've invested in it, will have one small window of opportunity to reach out to. But that's it. So it wasn't that having this vicar and this vicarage and all this other stuff was a waste of money. It was busy looking after a small sector of the parish, but most of the parishioners didn't live in the parish. So, how will we reach out and connect to them? Well, sisters and brothers, it will only be through people like you. It'll only be through developing not less chaplaincy, more. What's happened to workplace chaplaincy? What about developing more leisure chaplaincy? I would encourage you to carry on with the creative thinking you're already doing, but also to expand your horizons. And thank you so much for listening to me. It's all over now. You can happily get on with the rest of your day.